Welcome to Life by Design, episode 394. Welcome to Life by Design. I'm your host, Dr. Jamie Richards, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Dr. Cratio Jug.
Happy to be here, as always.
Yeah, great to have you, Cratio. We are creators of Life by Design with many locations worldwide. Not that I need to tell you that, but each week on the show, we discuss the principles and the practice of Life by Design. And today we're picking up where we left off with the Eat by Design fundamentals. And last week, if you didn't listen, then go back and check out episode number 1 of the Eat by Design fundamentals, where we revisited a lot of the basic concepts of Eat by Design. We went through the 10 Eat by Design principles: eat real food, protein with every meal, eat your vegetables, and eat more quality good fats. And I think we left off there because it's important to note that the first 4 steps of Eat by Design, and different from many quote unquote diet programs, the first 4 steps are about adding in. And I think that's an important concept to talk about very briefly. And that's, if you try to take things away, and we've talked about this in Think by Design episodes, if you try and take things away from people's lives, things they like or that are there for a reason, you're going to see a much bigger drop off, and it becomes more of a deal breaker.
Yeah, I mean, depravity is just, it's like saving your way into prosperity. It's impossible. You can't deprive your way into happiness,
Yes, exactly. You have to make the investment in many different ways. So now we're going to jump into the next 6, and we'll kind of rip through these. And again, there's lots of resources online, lots of resources at lifebydesign.com that you can go in and check that out. And we'll put the actual ebook in the show notes. So if you want to just grab the ebook, it's free anyway. And there's a lot more detail in there. lifebydesign.com/podcast. Find today's episode. So the next one, if there is a deal breaker, it's actually probably the next one, Cratio, and that's the removal of grains and legumes from the diet. So let me just give the basic fundamentals here. A lot of people, their diet has been embedded with grains and legumes to some degree. And really my point is this, and it's different from what I think people would expect. People expect to hear us say, you need to be gluten-free, and, we're pushing a gluten-free diet. What I'm saying is this, and I just think this is such an important point. If you're eating real food, your diet is by default gluten-free. So while gluten may be a food toxin, and that food toxin may be more significant for some and less significant for others, there's nothing in grains that you can't get in another food source that don't come in a higher quality, that don't come with more bioavailability, and that come with less potential food toxicity. So it's one of those things where, yes, for some people, eating grains and even gluten-containing grains could be devastating. And then for others, maybe less so. But the fact is, when you're filling your diet full of grains, you're replacing other more nutrient-dense foods. And I think that's the reason to generally remove grains and legumes.
I can't disagree. This is also, I think, important that we because the argument is always, it's a food group. Well, your body doesn't care about food groups. Food groups is just something that people made up.
Right.
The reason that, there's multiple reasons why.
Sure. It's a classification system, right? To understand information.
Well, sure. Yeah. But not just that. This is something that's been completely fabricated by food industries. And now, they lobby the makers of these diets, which is the government, right? So there's a big money trail. It's dirty. The point is this, bread is delicious, dough is delicious. Nobody's saying that it's not good. It is good. Try to limit it. It's not a good source of anything. It's potentially very harmful for people. Like for some people, this is an extreme, like their life. Removing grains for some people from their diet has been life-changing. And I don't say that.
No, it's true.
I don't say that that's the truth, right? So the point is this: if you want to eat it, great. Just really limit it, because it's not full of anything good.
Well, and it brings up another point that people might argue against, and that's, well, I've eaten grains to this point, I don't have a problem, which, that's a whole podcast in and of itself. Just because you don't have a symptom doesn't mean you don't have a problem. And just because you can't identify a problem doesn't mean a problem doesn't exist. And so, the fact that you can eat Twinkies doesn't mean that Twinkies are good for you. It doesn't mean that they're nutrient dense. It doesn't mean that they don't have a negative effect. And the same is true, let's say, for sugar, which is the next one we'll cover. When we get into that idea, of course you can eat sugar. Your body has glucose metabolism and fructose metabolism. It just doesn't mean that it's a nutrient dense source of food that's going to move your body towards a better expression of health. Now, when we come to, say, legumes, I don't want to say it's maybe more of a slippery slope. And I think the hierarchy principle is important to note here. And that's that, at the top of the hierarchy principle, the most potentially food toxic grains are going to be those with wheat in it and the protein gluten. Some of the other grains have less of a potential food toxicity effect. Now, they still don't have a ton of nutrients, but you could probably eat them with no real negative effect. So, for us, as an example, last night we had corn on the cob. It's summertime. We had corn on the cob slathered up in butter and salt and a big steak, and it was absolutely fantastic. We will occasionally eat white rice. We'll do corn tortillas, things along those lines. And then in terms of legumes, we'll still eat some hummus and things like that. But understand that in their natural state, you just don't, pull off a piece of grain and eat it, unless you're on a farm here in Blenheim, Ontario. But otherwise, you don't pull off a piece of grain and eat it. They have to be processed. Legumes need to be soaked or fermented in order to break down some of the potential food toxicity. So the fact that you have to go to that degree means that, there's a likelihood that, there's other foods that are going to have better nutrient sources in them.
Yeah, I mean, well, even with grains, or even with legumes, there's protein in it, and it's a decent source of protein. So if we're putting these things on a hierarchy, and you can prepare them to minimize the potential anti-nutrient things that it can cause, it's a better source, for sure.
Yep, for sure. So we get into sugar, and I think, this is one of those things where people are on, either people recognize that sugar is not good for you, quote unquote. There's people who think that it's, poison and are to the other degree. And I actually think that there's other more important steps to take with your diet. And so for an example, I definitely think, and that's why it's up near the top, eating more protein, by default, you're probably going to eat less sugar versus, I need to take out sugar. My kids can't have any sugar. Your body does have glucose metabolism. Like, your body can metabolize sugar. And so sugar, other than the fact that it's sugar, generally doesn't have a lot of other food toxicity other than it's, toxic in and of itself. But you get what I mean? It doesn't have these accessory toxins. If you eat the amount that your body can manage and it's not overwhelming, you're probably going to be fine. And that's my position on sugar. That and the fact that all sugar to me is sugar. So I don't want to hear arguments. Well, we use, agave nectar or, blackstrap molasses. And yeah, there may be some slight different, profiles in the nutrition, but ultimately, pouring pure sugar into your body is not going to be good. You can probably manage a little bit of it, but it shouldn't be the bulk of your diet.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you said it there. I think the issue with this is the overall deliciousness of sugar. To the point now where it's fabricated, right? We all know that high fructose corn syrup doesn't exist in nature. And again, in and of itself, it's probably not the worst thing ever. It becomes problematic when it's all that you're consuming. And, companies are creating food to, chemically get you hooked on eating more of the food.
Sure. Well, this is actually probably a great springboard into the concept of hyperpalatability, just how good food tastes. If you look in nature, there really is no combination of a high sugar food with a high fat food and a high salt food, right? Those things don't actually mix together. And so because of those things, when you put them together, they are absolute deliciousness. And that goes for all of us. Last night I popped a few chocolate covered almonds. They're like salted chocolate covered almonds, and, it was very difficult to stop. And I'm pretty dedicated to what we eat, but I'll tell you, you can see how it can take you down a slippery slope. So I think, if you are eating sugar, one of the best strategies is to try and eat it in its natural form. And so that's where, say, fruit comes in. We'll do berries and heavy cream, or it's a different version of sugar, and one that your body's going to have an easier time being less addicted to. So I think that's an important concept here. And then again, as you said, just kind of being aware that, there could be an addiction side of things, and to not get hooked, really, because that's the toughest part of its break.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Number 7 is earn your carbs. Also could be a deal breaker here. I think it's important to note at Life by Design for years, since 2011 when we first originally wrote the Eat by Design book. And I mean, we're in 2000, so 10 years, Horatio. So we've been talking about this for 10 years. We've been talking about a concept that we call carbohydrate appropriateness. There's lots of people who talk about low carb diets, and keto's super trendy right now. We've always said carbohydrates in and of themselves are not bad. That, they're looked at in many circles, especially fat loss circles and weight loss circles, as poison. You need to get rid of carbs. And it's important to know that in the majority of cases, getting to the point where people were super overweight or obese was likely not from eating carbohydrates. But that said, a lower carbohydrate diet, statistically, with good research, is probably one of the, if not the best way to lose body fat. But I don't think that it's, the key here is not to villainize carbohydrates in and of themselves, right? Although it's a great strategy to reduce weight. So the point is earning your carbohydrates. So focusing on real food sources of carbohydrates, taking into account what's my current goals, what is my current exercise or activity output, what's my genetic heritage. You'll get an idea of how your body responds to carbohydrates as you kind of implement and tweak and test. But we don't want people to think that Eat by Design or anybody should just blanket, not eat carbohydrates.
I think it's crazy that eating appropriate amount of carbohydrates, which should not be the majority of your diet, is considered low carbohydrate eating. Like I'm still, it's crazy, the definitions, and the other thing that here is, this is the point where you still have the conversation around like, yes, you need a calorie deficit to be losing weight.
Sure.
But much more important, than just having a calorie deficit is making sure all of the steps above this step are in place. This is right. The one you're right. Like I don't know, man. I'm not overly thrilled for people who can lose weight temporarily and then they gain it all back. And it's this yo-yo thing. That's why these, our goal is human flourishing, but also human health. So we're interested in not just, having you be lean, but actually having you be healthy.
Well, I would say, and I've been talking a bit more about this lately, one of the most important strategies in weight loss and fat loss that goes overlooked is actually not being hungry.
Yeah,
we talk about a caloric deficit, which is important, but a caloric deficit doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have extreme hunger. And I think that's where people make a big mistake is they assume that, and they might create a deficit, but if you actually look at their food logs, which we've looked at in thousands, they'll have a great deficit for the whole week, and then they'll go totally the opposite direction on the weekend. And when you look at the numbers, it is very easy to erase a deficit. To create a 200 or 300, 400, 500 calorie deficit every day takes a little bit of work and planning, but that only gives you a 2,500 calorie deficit up to, say, Friday. You could easily go on one, binge meal or 2 binge meals, and all of a sudden that deficit's erased, and you're on the other side of that. And fast forward 90 days, right? And you're like, I'm really doing so well. I can't figure out why my diet isn't working. It's like, well, it's all just math. That's why it's not working. So, consuming the appropriate amount of carbohydrates, eating real food, and kind of going through those first 7 steps, as you said, is the most important piece. Step number 8, essentials. When people talk about getting healthy, we talked about it last week, people want to stop drinking coffee, they want to run marathons, and they want to take supplements.
Yep.
Those are like the first 3 things, which just blows my mind. Supplements.
And stop eating meat.
And stop eating meat. Yeah, so those are the 4 things that people, actually, that's another podcast to talk about. The 4 things people want to do to get healthy.
And do a cleanse. And do a cleanse,
yes. And so those are definitely not high on our list, if not, way out of the list. And so what are supplements? They are supplements. They supplement your diet. We feel strong that if you're eating real food on a consistent basis, if you're getting sun exposure without sunscreen, if you are, essentially following a healthy lifestyle and the blueprint that we've mapped out, for the most part, you're not going to need to supplement a lot. And remember, you technically should be able to get to the point where you don't supplement with anything. If you were really diligent enough, right? So for example, vitamin D optimization is important. If you are getting enough sun, and you're getting your blood levels tested and your vitamin D is optimized, you may not need to supplement with that. Now, the reality is most people aren't, and they aren't sufficient, and so we need to supplement. The same thing with omega-3 saturation. If you were eating lots of grass-fed meat and fresh fish, and you may very well, and not eating a lot of canola oils and seed oils, and you may very well have a great omega-3 to 6 ratio, and you may not need to supplement with an omega-3 fat. The reality is most people aren't, and hence an essential. The other ones for us, probiotics, 2 ratio I've added in my practice, vitamin K2 and magnesium. So the essentials for me are 5. I know we started at 3. I'm not sure if you've added those in yourself, but for us, these are the 5 essentials.
Yeah, I like magnesium. I'm not taking K2. And again, I think it's important here that, this is the requirements and strategies conversation. You did such a good job of saying it. You don't need to supplement with vitamin D. You need vitamin D in your body.
That's right.
Right. The preferred mechanism, and the one that with which we evolved in, is getting it from the sun.
That's
Unfortunately, right. we live in southwestern Ontario, and we don't have the sun from October to June. That's a lot of months without your body
Correct.
being exposed and your body naturally creating these things that they need. So that's why supplementing with vitamin D is a recommendation. And the cool thing about it is you can actually test to make sure you're in the proper range.
Right.
And the same thing is true with same with probiotics. You don't need probiotics. You need to be eating fermented food, and you need to make sure you don't.
You need a healthy gut.
That's it. You need a healthy gut. And the reality of it is the vast majority of us, for better or worse, I'm not saying these things weren't required at one time, have taken antibiotics. Antibiotics are not selective in the bacteria that they destroy. They destroy all the bacteria. We know that bacteria is necessary for a healthy gut, right? So this is just, ways of replenishing the natural, normal state of your body.
Exactly. Number 9, dairy. Dairy is a gray area. So this is our position on dairy. Dairy could be a nutrient-dense food for some people. Well, actually, it's a nutrient-dense food. It could be acceptable for some people, and it really depends on the body's ability to adapt. So a great example of just how the body adapts, for the longest time, most people assumed that all humans were lactose intolerant, and you can actually see the development of tolerance, right, in certain genomes, in certain populations. And so it's interesting to see just how the body's epigenetics can create such a significant change as a response to, some type of repetitive, stimulus in that sense. The reality is, again, dairy, it's not like you were getting raw dairy from the cow. It's not like we're getting it in its normal natural state. It's been processed. It's been, pasteurized. The bacteria has been removed. You have things added back in to fortify it with, whether it be probiotics or calcium and some other components. And so, sure, for me, if you're adapted, dairy could be a good whole food source. So we'll do butter, ghee, fermented dairy in some cases, cream. I know for Dana, my wife, she can do no dairy. So hers is not a lactose intolerance. Hers is actually a dairy allergies to the proteins, which are the most common. But she can do ghee. So that just confirms that it's a protein allergy because ghee is clarified butter. So there is no proteins in it. It's pretty much just dairy fat. And she's fine with that. So, when people say, again, could be a deal breaker, right? A lot of people like cheese or they like milk. I think number one, I don't see any reason to drink milk whatsoever. I just don't see it as a nutrient-dense food, and I just think there's far too many potential negative consequences to it. And with the nut milks that exist today, there's really no reason not to, right? I mean, whether it be cashew milk or almond milk or coconut milk, there's lots of other versions where you can get that. And in terms of the calcium conversation, there's other ways to get calcium, in addition to the fact that I think the calcium recommendations are probably too high anyway. So the bioavailability of calcium in milk, you're far better off just eating vegetables and nuts and seeds. And, if you really want, you can just eat canned salmon, and there's bones in there. You can eat those too. So bone health is not about jamming calcium into your body. There's a lot of other components. So I don't think dairy is one of those things. Oh my gosh, what if my kids don't drink milk, right? They're not going to be okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. I'm listening, and it's just interesting how things happen in your life. Milk is one of those things as a kid, because I would eat boxes of cereal. I just never ever thought that I'd ever be able to. I remember hearing and starting to read and then just being worried. Oh my God, how am I going to give up my dairy? And
right.
Here we are. And it's been no problem, after a while.
No problem.
It's interesting. Yeah, no problem. I don't even like the taste of it anymore. Like it's just one of those things that I've never craved since I gave it up as a kid. And yes, the concern isn't even about dairy necessarily. It's the idea that dairy somehow is the only conveyor of calcium, which is the only ingredient necessary for your bones to be strong and healthy.
Yeah.
I don't have the data in front of me, but pretty sure, yes, calcium of course is important, but I'm pretty sure like weight training and making sure that
yeah, weight bearing is more important. This is where some of the micronutrients, where vitamin K2 comes in. Interesting research over the last, I guess, 5 years now. You've even physicians now not recommending calcium supplementation because of the increase in heart attacks and calcium being deposited inside the interior walls, where the role of vitamin K2 is to make sure that calcium gets preferentially deposited in your bones and not your organ systems and your arteries. So that's an important concept. And then you got boron and K2, magnesium. You got all these other components that are important in bone health and bone development. I do want to make a note here, and one of the things that people maybe are saying, no dairy. I want to make sure they get the principle right, because people will say, we don't drink dairy because we're the only mammal that drinks another mammal's milk. And I actually don't think that is, exactly. That is actually not the reason we're saying no dairy. It's kind of like the gluten thing, right? People, we're gluten-free. We don't drink dairy, gluten's bad. And we're the only mammal that drinks another mammal's milk. Well, the fact is gluten is not in real food. So that's number one. It's not there. And number two, we're also the only mammal that cooks our food. So it doesn't mean we shouldn't cook our food.
Or that walks upright.
Well, exactly. And so the context here is it doesn't matter that we're the only mammal that drinks another mammal's milk. We're humans, and we have the ability to, use our ingenuity to uncover things that can actually benefit us as a species going forward. We live in houses, we build things, it just goes on and on and on. And so it's not a great argument. The argument here is that it's potentially toxic in the sense that if you have a food allergy to dairy proteins, then it's not going to be good for you. And
it's actually, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Krish.
It's a non-argument. It's a logical fallacy. It's called a non sequitur. Like you're bringing in something that has nothing to do with the actual matter at hand.
Right.
And trying to say, well, because we don't do this, then that can't possibly be true. And the point is, it doesn't matter, right? There's, like you said, there's other things that we do that nobody else does that are actually beneficial to us. So
that's correct. That's exactly. And so number 10, we'll finish with this one, guys. And then what I'll have you do is go to the show notes, lifebydesign.com/podcast, find today's episode, and you can check out everything there. Grab the ebook. It's got everything in there that you're going to need to get yourself started. Stop counting calories. So the caveat here is there's probably a time where counting calories and macros and all those things can be valuable. So I'm not saying that it's not. I'm simply saying that there's a lot of other things that you can do first before you get to that point. And so real food, protein, good fats, veggies, minimizing your grains and legumes and sugar, supplementing where necessary, considering what your carbohydrate intake should look like based on your genetic profile and your activity output. Dairy is a gray area. Am I adapted? Am I not? All those things first. The body has just an uncanny ability to self-regulate. And when you're eating those things as a large volume compared to everything else, you have a sense of when you're full. You have a sense of how much food you need to eat based on your energy output and needs. Only if you're not achieving goals specific to, let's say, health or specific to weight loss or weight gain, at that point, I think there would be value in doing some caloric counting or some macros, just as a baseline to see, where reality is differing from, what you're actually doing.
Yes, totally agree. It's hard to, it's a hard mindset thing to get your head around, because, nutrition is, I think just recently it's becoming popular. Like I'm talking about like the last 10, 15, 20 years, it's become, related. Health has become related to what you're actually eating, whereas when we were growing up, it was just something with weight gain. Well, you're fat because you eat too much, so you need to eat less, was kind of the mentality. And like the food you were putting into your body really didn't matter with how your health was. Like people honestly didn't think that skin conditions, for example, or had anything to do with food, or chronic illness had anything to do with food. That was, And now the link is starting to happen, but people still link it to, well, I don't like the way that I look, so I got to eat less. And that's where the starting point is.
Yeah. Guys, a lot of good stuff over these last 2 podcasts. If you have not implemented some of the action steps of Eat by Design, here's your chance. So as I said, go grab the ebook and get yourself started. Feel free to post any questions that you want. We'll do our best to tackle those. And guys, thank you so much for joining the drive to 1 million families worldwide living life by design.